Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. All praise is due to Allah, and may the peace and blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon our last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum. My brothers, my name is Yusuf Yee, James Yusuf Yee, and I am the former U.S. Army Muslim chaplain who served at Guantanamo Bay back in 2002 and 2003, and inshallah I'm going to talk about my experience being a Muslim in the U.S. military, being a Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo. But I want to start by telling you just a little bit about myself. I'm a third generation Chinese American. Third generation. My grandparents, they came from China to the United States. My mother and father both were born here in America. And then myself and all my brothers and sisters born here in America. And I was raised being born here in America as a Christian, Lutheran, which is one of the Protestant denominations. And it was after I graduated high school in New Jersey that I decided that I would go to the prestigious United States Military Academy called West Point. And when I went to West Point and graduated in 1990, I didn't have any classes or courses when I was there about religion, or about comparative religion, or about Islam. And I didn't know much about Islam when I graduated as an officer into the United States Army. But after I graduated, I met a young student in Washington, D.C., and we had this discussion, this dialogue about faith. And I was asked what I thought about belief in one God, but that God didn't have a son, as is taught in Christianity. And I was asked what I thought about Islam, where we believe in one God, and that Jesus, Isa, alayhi salatu wassalam, is not the Son of God. And being a Christian at that time, I said to this person, no, that's misguidance. I'm a Christian and I believe in what's called the doctrine of the Trinity, where Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And then this person asked me, what do you know about Islam? I said, I don't know anything about Islam. And she said, how can you then judge Islam if you don't know anything about it? So I began myself to learn about Islam. And I went to the bookstore and I bought a book about Islam, a general book. And I became quickly intrigued about Islam. And when I started to learn about Islam, I found a lot of this faith very similar to Christianity, because there were certain prophets like Moses and David and Abraham and Noah and Joseph. And I knew about all of these biblical prophets that we find also in Islam, because I was raised as Christian and I went to Sunday school as a youngster, and I became very intrigued to learn that these prophets were also in the Quran. I didn't know that. And then I learned that even in Islam, Muslims believe that Jesus, Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, was also born of the Virgin Mary. And as a Christian, I didn't know there were any others who also believed in this, because that's a very important aspect of the Christian faith, that Jesus is born from Virgin Mary. So I became very intrigued. And then I learned about Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he had the same message as all of the previous prophets. And it wasn't long after that in New Jersey when I said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. And I became Muslim. That was back in 1991. And I was an officer in the U.S. military. I was a young officer. And as I went to my first assignment as an officer in Germany, I was an air defense artillery officer that was qualified to control what's called a Patriot missiles fire control battery. A missile system that shot Patriot missiles in the air. And we know about this system because it was used in the first Gulf War to shoot down Scud missiles coming from Iraq, from Saddam Hussein. And I was deployed to Saudi Arabia. And at that time, the war had already ended. But I went to join a Patriot missiles unit. And I had only converted to Islam 5 months earlier. So even then, I still didn't know much about Islam. But what I knew about Islam was that Muslims were from Middle East. And then in America, Muslims were African American. Many of them who came from Nation Islam. This is what I knew. But when I became Muslim because I believed I could believe in one God. La ilaha illallah. And when I got to Saudi Arabia as a soldier, I learned that American Muslim soldiers, they can go at the expense of the Saudi Air Force to visit Mecca for Umrah. And I had only been Muslim 5 months. And I went to my commander and said, there's a memorandum from the general who says that American Muslims like me can go to Umrah and go visit Mecca. And at first my commander was upset. And he said, no, we didn't bring you here to go on some spiritual pilgrimage. You came as U.S. soldiers. But when he saw the memorandum signed by the general, he had to say, okay, you can go. And I went on this trip with some other American Muslim soldiers. 3 of them were brand new shahadas. And we were escorted by a Muslim from the Saudi Air Force. And I'm thinking as a new Muslim, Chinese American, that I'm going to Mecca, but that I would be the only Chinese Muslim there. Because I didn't know the full demographics of Islam around the world. But when our bus came to the holy city of Mecca, to the holy mosque, the first large group of other Muslims that I saw walking past were other Asian Muslims. I think maybe they were from Indonesia or Malaysia, but they had features like myself. And I said, inshallah. And in those 3 days, we met Muslims from Africa, from Arab countries, from Russia, from Europe. And I even met another Muslim who was from America. He was from Medina. He was studying Islam in Medina at the university. But he was from America. So for me, I was inspired by Islam to see that Muslims were really from all over the world. But in the military, as an officer, I observed that we had Christian chaplains to give church service on Sundays. There were Jewish chaplains who gave Jewish services on Friday night. But back in 1991 and 92, 93, there were no Muslim chaplains. I was a new Muslim. And in Saudi Arabia, I saw many of the soldiers becoming Muslim from being in Saudi. They say that maybe 5,000, maybe 7,000 American soldiers converted to Islam from going to Saudi Arabia in the first Gulf War. So the numbers of Muslims in the American army back then were growing very quickly, but we didn't have a Muslim chaplain. So being inspired, I thought maybe I'll become a chaplain to help Muslims who are in the army, in the Navy, in the Air Force. And so I left the U.S. military. I left active duty after 3 years. And I ended up going on a Hajj. And from the Hajj, I remember that student that I met from America who was studying in Medina, and I tried to go and study in Medina, but they didn't accept me. And I met on a Hajj translator. He was from Damascus, and somehow I ended up in Damascus. And I went to study and learn some Arabic language, learn about Islam from the ulama, from the shuyukh, and I got a basic understanding of Islam, the religion that I converted to, after being raised Christian. And then I came back to the United States in 2000, the year 2000, after spending maybe 3-4 years in Damascus, Syria, where I was also teaching English as a second language to Syrian adults. But in the year 2000, I came back, and then I applied to go back into the U.S. military to become a chaplain. And I had hoped at one time that maybe I would be the first Muslim chaplain in the U.S. military. But in 2000, when I came back and they accepted my request and I became a chaplain, I wasn't the first Muslim chaplain. By that time, there were Muslim chaplains, 1 or 2 of them in the Navy, there was 1 or 2 in the Air Force, and there were maybe 6 or so now serving in the U.S. Army. But in January of 2001, I was the newest Muslim chaplain. And I started my new career now as a Muslim chaplain. Still an officer in the Army, in January 2001. And that same year, just 9 months later, in that fateful month of September 2001, September 11th, 2001, everyone knows what happened on that day. The attacks on the World Trade Center. There was an attack on the Pentagon. There was another plane that would then crash in Pennsylvania on September 11th. And at that time, I was a chaplain in the U.S. military, representing Islam, representing Muslims. And after those attacks, I was someone who immediately said publicly, whoever conducted these attacks, killing innocent people, they have to be brought to justice. Whether they were Muslim, whether they weren't Muslim, didn't matter. They killed innocent people. And then my name began to be circulated as a Muslim chaplain through the Pentagon, through the State Department. I was an officer from West Point, a Muslim chaplain. And when the media wanted to do an interview of a Muslim in the U.S. military, they came to me. And I gave interviews. And I got some praise and recognition from upper level officers throughout the military. And I gained some respect. So after our military troops then went into Afghanistan and began capturing prisoners, putting them in Guantanamo Bay, what did the U.S. government do? They said, we need to send a Muslim chaplain there to show that we're sensitive and we're accommodating these Muslim prisoners in Guantanamo. We need to send a Muslim chaplain, and we know who to send. Chaplain Yee. And they sent me to Guantanamo in November of 2002. And I think back to when they sent me there, and how I used to think that the reason why they sent me to Guantanamo was so that America, the U.S. government, George Bush as president, he could say, look, we're treating these Muslims in Guantanamo in a good way, in a humane way. We even sent their own Muslim chaplain to serve them. But when I got to Guantanamo, that happening to these Muslims in Guantanamo, where there were hundreds of them. Hundreds of them. There were almost 700 Muslims when I was there. And every prisoner in Guantanamo was a Muslim. And from the moment I stepped into the cell blocks of Camp Delta in Guantanamo Bay, it was clear that Muslims were being abused. And my job as a chaplain, speaking to the Muslim prisoners every day, I learned of what was really going on inside this camp. Abuse. Because they were suspected prisoners, suspected terrorists, suspected of being from Al-Qaeda or Taliban. When the truth was, most of them had nothing to do with that, had nothing to do with terrorism. And most of them were even sold into captivity by Afghani warlords who received money for turning over to the Northern Alliance or turning over to the U.S. military someone who they said was the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. And in return, the U.S. government would give $4,000 or $5,000 for each person that they turned over. So these Afghani warlords made a lot of money selling people to the U.S. government, and then these people would end up in Guantanamo Bay. But I would hear from the prisoners and learn from the American Muslim translators in Guantanamo what goes on inside the interrogation room when the Muslim gets taken. And by and large, these Muslims were persecuted for being Muslim. How so? One, and this was news back in 2003, 2005. There was a news piece that came out in Newsweek that said in Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. military is desecrating the Quran. The words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was going on when I was there. The guards, sometimes they threw the Quran on the floor when they searched the cell. The interrogator sometimes took the Quran in the interrogation room when the Muslim prisoner was shackled at the wrist and the waist in the chair, being interrogated. The interrogator would take the Quran and would throw it on the floor in front of the Muslim to see how he would react. He might step on it. That interrogator might sit on it. And it angered the Muslim prisoners. And when Muslim prisoners went back to their cells, they began to riot and demonstrate. They banged on their steel doors and banged on their steel walls and banged on their steel beds in protest of how American soldiers, interrogators, and other intelligence officers abused the Quran, the words of Allah. There were even investigations later conducted into the abuse of the Quran. Investigations conducted by the military. And they revealed that even there was one instance where the Quran, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was urinated on by American soldiers. How else were Muslims being persecuted for being Muslim in Guantanamo? One Muslim prisoner told me what happened to him when he went into an interrogation room. He told me he was in an interrogation room, and on the floor of the room was a large circle. And in that circle was a star-shaped pentagram symbol to represent Shaitan, a satanic circle, a satanic symbol in the middle of the circle. And then the interrogator took that Muslim prisoner and put him in the center of this satanic circle. And he tried to force this Muslim to make sujood, to bow down in the center of the satanic circle, to make ruku in the center of the satanic circle. And that American translator, that American interrogator, screamed at that Muslim that Satan is your God, not Allah. Why did that person do that to this Muslim? Because he knew that Muslims believe in what? La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah. And he tried to break that Muslim and other Muslims of that belief in Allah. break him of that belief in Allah. That's how Muslims are being persecuted. Why did they desecrate the Quran? Because they knew that we as Muslims, when we put the Quran on a shelf, it's in the highest place in our house. That we respect the words of Allah. That for us, these are the literal words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not like any other book, that we memorize it. So even if you burn the Quran, we have it here and we have it here. And they try to break these Muslims from the words of Allah, from the Quran. That's how they persecuted Muslims. So as a chaplain, as an officer in the U.S. Army, as a U.S. citizen, as a Muslim, I went to the command and said, what are we doing here in Guantanamo Bay? Why are we persecuting Muslim prisoners for being Muslim? Think about how America started when the first people came from Europe and landed here on Plymouth Rock, it's called, in Massachusetts. These people known as pilgrims. They came to the United States, they came to the new land. Why? Because they wanted a place where they could be free and have their religion the way they want. Religious freedom. That was the first reason why people came and established America. Religious freedom. And then that was written into the U.S. Constitution, that everyone should have religious freedom. And that's why actually there are chaplains in the military, to protect religion for people who serve. That's why, technically, I was sent to Guantanamo to protect the ability of Muslim prisoners to have faith and practice their religion in Guantanamo. But when I learned of how they were being persecuted, I objected and I said, this is wrong. This is not who we are as Americans. But some people in Guantanamo didn't like when I did that. Especially those who were doing this stuff to the prisoners. People from the FBI, people from the CIA maybe, people from the Defense Intelligence Agency, people from military intelligence. They didn't like when I said, why are we torturing prisoners here in Guantanamo? So what happened? They created this plot, this plan, and then they accused me of being a terrorist. They said, you're with them, you're with the terrorist prisoners. And then they locked me up. They arrested me in secret when I was on a plane from Guantanamo coming back into the United States. When I landed in Florida at the Naval Air Base, I was swarmed by customs and immigration officers who said, what are you carrying in your backpack? They said I had some suspicious documents. Then there were intelligence officers there, military intelligence, army counterintelligence, naval criminal investigators, the FBI. They interrogated me on that day. And they said, this is what you got in your backpack. It's classified information. And they arrested me in secret. They locked me away. I never got home that day. I was living at that time in Olympia, Washington, not far from South Seattle. South Seattle, where probably many of you have family. I never made it back to Seattle from Florida that day. Instead, my family didn't know what happened. It was like I had disappeared in America because I was secretly arrested and then shipped to this place in Charleston, South Carolina, known as the Consolidated Naval Break, a maximum security prison run by the U.S. military. I was in this prison, and they were accusing me of being a terrorist. They said they were going to charge me with spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, treason, and they even threatened me with the death penalty. When they shipped me to this prison, I was shackled at the wrist, at the waist, the ankles, in the suit of chains, just like the way the prisoners in Guantanamo were shackled. They put these things on my eyes, they're goggles, I couldn't see. They put these devices on my ears, I couldn't hear. They call that sensory deprivation. You've seen the photos, how they treat the terrorists, suspect the terrorists. sensory deprivation. And then they put me in solitary confinement, where I was there for 76 days. Who else was in this prison where I was? Some guy named Jose Padilla. Another guy named Yasser Hamdi. People that the American government were accusing of being enemy combatants. And then I was there. They said I was a terrorist spy for the prisoners in Guantanamo. But when all was said and done, and the truth came out that the only thing I had done was to raise objections to the torture and abuse of prisoners in Guantanamo, I was released. And I was reinstated as an officer in the military. And when that happened, I resigned my commission from the U.S. military. And I got an honorable discharge in January 2005. I got an honorable discharge after all of that. But I was in that jail cell for 76 days. 76 days. And you know what? Back in 2003, of those 76 days, 30 of those days was during the month of Ramadan. I spent the entire month of Ramadan in solitary confinement by myself back in 2003. I wasn't able to break fast, to have iftar with my family, or at the masjid with the community. I wasn't able to stand up in salah and make taraweeh with the jama'ah. That was taken away from me for those entire 30 days. And I remember the harrowing ordeal being in that cell by myself, where at first nobody knew where I was. Nobody knew if I was even still alive. And I didn't have anything. Didn't have anyone except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I had my deen, because I was now Muslim. I had converted to Islam and become a Muslim chaplain. That's all I had. And I remember becoming Muslim and learning the dua, Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakeel. Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakeel. That for me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone in this life is enough. Allah. Because He is the best disposer of our affairs. So in that cell by myself, in solitary confinement, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for me is enough. And I remember in those 76 days, just making dhikr, reciting that dua, and reciting other du'as, and reading Quran. I remember being inspired by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran. وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ. That we should seek the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in patience and perseverance, and also in our salah, in our prayer. So in that cell, what could I do? Except trust Allah and make my salah. They can't prevent me from making my salah, even in that cell. Even though they refuse to give me the prayer times. They refuse to tell me which way was Qibla. But I can make my salah. They can't stop me in that cell. They can't take my Islam away from me in that cell. And that gave me strength. And I remember also from reading Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah Azza wa Jal, where He says, الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. That for anyone, if they're ever afflicted with great difficulty, with great calamity, what should they do? They should say, to Allah we belong, and to Him, inshaAllah, we shall return. So this difficulty, this calamity, this musibah that I am in this cell, solitary confinement, what can I do? I can say, to Allah I belong, and to Allah, inshallah, I will return. This is how I survived that ordeal in solitary confinement. My faith during a time of crisis had to be rock solid on Islam and on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's my experience as a Muslim chaplain in the U.S. military, as an American Muslim who converted to Islam. But it shows the importance of our faith in our daily lives, so that whenever there's difficulty, we know that Islam, and we know that with Allah, we have strength, and we have hope, and we have inspiration. That no matter how bad things can get, everything is done according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's divine wisdom and plan. Because it says in the Quran, عَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. That maybe you hate something, but in it, there is much good. Much good that you don't even know about. And as much as I hated being in solitary confinement, as much as I hated being disappeared in America from my family, as much as I hated them calling me a terrorist and a spy and a traitor to my own country, and as much as I hated being shackled up and humiliated and strip searched every day and subjected to that sensory deprivation, as much as I hated all that, I understood that this is Allah's plan, that this is the qadr of Allah, and that in some way, shape or form, there is some good in what's happening to me. And alhamdulillah, I was released. Charges against me were dropped. My record wiped clean. Left the U.S. military, got an honorable discharge. Later wrote a book about my experience and exposed prisoner abuse in Guantanamo and detailed my struggle for justice. And it's my hope today that as I go and speak to many different communities, Muslim and non-Muslim, Muslim and people of other faiths, as I speak to people across the country, and sometimes outside the country, like in the UK, like in India, like in Germany, and other places that I've gone to talk about Guantanamo and my experience. It's my hope that I'm able to inspire people to be strong in their faith and inspire Muslims to recognize that what we have in Islam is something very valuable, and how important it is for us to keep it and to nourish it and to be one ummah and to have the strength of faith and the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I hope today that as I share with you my story of becoming Muslim, my story of struggle in a time of crisis, that I've somehow inspired you in some way today to be a better Muslim, to be a strong Muslim. My brothers, my name is Brother Yusuf Yee, James Yusuf Yee, former U.S. Army Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo Bay. It's very much an honor and a pleasure to sit here in front of you, share my story, and to have that opportunity to pray next to my Muslim brothers in the masjid. Because I remember back in 2003 in that cell, that was taken away from me. And every time I pray in Jama'ah, I remember my salah has multiple blessings with the Jama'ah. Shukran, jazakum Allah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So if anyone has a question, inshallah, or a comment, you're welcome, inshallah. So we'll have about 10 minutes for questions.
Shukran.
If you don't have any questions, then...
Shukran. Assalamu alaikum. Iskal Barak. Say hi. comments or questions, please.
Yeah.
I'm free to answer. And be advised, be warned, understand that anything I've said today, there's nothing classified, nothing that can get me in trouble for what I've talked about, what I've revealed. Most of it is already documented in my book. I'm very careful about what I say, and so alhamdulillah, don't be afraid of material. What is the name of the book that you wrote? The name of the book is called For God and Country, Faith and Patriotism Under Fire. For God and Country. Faith and Patriotism Under Fire. And it's available on Amazon. It was published in late 2005. But the material is still very relevant because President Obama, he promised to close Guantanamo, but he never did. And most people don't recognize or realize Guantanamo Bay is still there. There are still 170 prisoners still in Guantanamo, and President Obama has actually backtracked and has actually helped institutionalize, made permanent, along with Congress, Guantanamo Bay. It doesn't look like Guantanamo will be closed, despite his promise to close it when he was elected president. Question here first.
Comment for me.
Comment.
I just want to appreciate your sharing with us your story. It's really a pleasure for us to be here and listen to you. I watched some documentary about you before, and I'm really happy to be here with you. And I hope you do multiple, and as you just said, sharing your story. You inspire a lot of people. It inspires me. And will inspire
Inshallah.
we can relate to.
Make dua, inshallah, that I'm able to continue to inspire our community.
Oh, sir, you told us to some native U.S. Army not understand the whereabouts to Afghanistan to buy the people and the kill.
He's saying that you were talking about in Afghanistan, the warlords selling,
Yes.
capturing people and selling.
Yeah, people in Afghanistan were capturing people and selling them to the U.S.
U.S. Army not understand that.
They didn't know. They didn't
So
understand.
they turned them over and said, this is a terrorist. This is from Taliban. And then the U.S. Army would give them money, and then they would take this person and send them to Guantanamo. But most of them were innocent. And actually there are reports that even people in the White House, as far up as at least the Vice President, Dick Cheney, and others, who knew that many of the people in Guantanamo were innocent, but they didn't want to release them because one, they didn't want to look bad, and two, they believed that they can still get some type of information from them. And this is something that Colin Powell, who was the Secretary of State, his Chief of Staff, said that people high up in the White House had meetings about this, and that even the President knew about this information.
Is there any person that helped you when you were in custody that you feels that you're innocent and you're charged with something that,
Like a lawyer?
like any person that you can
Yeah, was there anyone who helped me while I was in the prison? From within the military, almost nobody helped me. From within our own military. Even the chief of the chaplains, the highest general of the chaplains, who I was a chaplain, didn't even support me. Right? But my commander from Washington State, when I was living in Olympia, Washington, because I was stationed at Fort Lewis, my commander from Washington State, he tried to intervene because he knew me very well. And he trusted me. I was a good officer and tried to get involved, and he was ordered to stay away from this case. But it wasn't in prison until I was able to get an attorney, a real qualified attorney, and I hired an attorney from Washington, D.C. He's an expert in military law. I had to have a special attorney because I was under the military justice system. He's now retired, but he now teaches military law at Yale University. But with his expertise in defending me, he was able to attack their military lawyers would show that and demand for them to prove that I had committed a crime, which there was no evidence, and that's eventually how all of my charges were dropped. Any other questions?
Yes, so what do you do these days?
So what do I do? Okay. So after I got out of the military, I wrote a book, became an author. I began to do public speaking. I spoken at many, many different universities. I'm here in Minnesota because I spoke Thursday evening at Metropolitan University in St. Paul. But I have frequently traveled to different colleges and universities across the country. In 2010, I became the executive director of CARE New Jersey, the Council on American Islamic Relations New Jersey chapter. So I worked in Muslim civil rights from August of 2010 till January of this year. I departed from CARE in January of this year, and since then I've been unemployed, but every now and then I'll have a lecture or presentation to give like I did Thursday. At the same time, I took this time also to enroll in a local state college in New Jersey where I live now, where I grew up. And I'm actually refreshing some of my Arabic language skills. And so I'm taking Arabic classes again. And also, because I'm a third-generation Chinese American who doesn't speak Chinese, I also am taking Chinese 101 to learn a little bit of Mandarin. And so, that's good for me. So that's what I'm doing during this time being.
How about family, brothers, sisters?
Family, I have 2 older sisters. One of them who just moved to this area. She is what's north of Eden Prairie.
Okay.
North of Eden Prairie is where. I don't know I forget. Garden Grove or something? Grove Garden? Maple Grove. So she'll be moving to Maple Grove next week. So my sister just moved here. My older sister just moved here with her family, her husband and daughter. And I have 2 younger brothers. Now, both of my younger brothers also served in the U.S. military. My father also served in the army. He was drafted during World War II. World War II, which tells you how old he is. My dad is 85 years old. So my family's been here in America for over 80 years. But for some reason or not, when we grew up, we never spoke Chinese in the house. Only English. So as a result, I don't know any Chinese. Except how to say hello. Like, ne homa. And Happy New Year. Happy New Year. In Cantonese. Dong Hei Fat Choi. That's it. Maybe I know more Somali language than I do Chinese. Thank you. When I became Muslim, how did my family react? Well, my father, very educated, very intellectual, but very secular. So my father is non-religious at all. But he's very educated, so he understood Islam from reading, accurate sources. So for him, also, he raised me as an adult to make my own decisions. So if I wanted to become Muslim, he's like, that's what you want to do? Okay, no problem. But my mother was the one who raised me as Christian. My mother goes to church every Sunday. She's Lutheran. She's somewhat religious. And so she thought that I converted to Islam because I didn't understand Christianity. And that I should come back and learn again, what I had learned in Sunday school and as a youngster. But I didn't go back. But after I became a Muslim chaplain, it became recognized. My mother gained an appreciation for my accomplishments. And then when I was put in jail, my mother and father were my #1 supporters, fighting for my justice. And after I was released and went on to gain even a larger profile, now my mother, is very proud that I am, a famous American Muslim. Even though she's still Christian, she's very proud that her son is an author of a book, and that I'm a high-profile Muslim American in this country that many people know about me. I'm the only Muslim in my family, of my brothers and sisters.
Don't forget your daughter.
Other than my daughter and my wife. Shukran, jazakallah khair. Again, an honor and pleasure. I hope to come back sometime. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. And inshallah, tonight at program we have another Muslim American. His name is Jamal.